Come with me now. Come with me now. I'm gonna take you down. Come with me now. I'm gonna show you how. Come with me now.
Alright, welcome back. So what we're going to talk about today is the complications to fiscal policy. But before we begin with that, what I wanted to go over is a couple of little bit of review things. We're going to review some of the multiplier stuff, and I'm going to review, well, just right here on this warm-up, the difference between expansionary and contractionary policy. So if, for whatever reason, the government decided to help us out with our mortgages, our car loans, our student loans, and they paid for all those things, that would generally be seen as expansionary. Okay, because any government spending is going to end up shifting aggregate demand, and so you're going to see an expansionary effect. Later on, though, when the taxes are going to have to be increased to pay for all that spending, that would then be contractionary, meaning it would shift aggregate demand back to the left. All right, so real quick, let's talk about the multiplier. So what we discussed last class was that anytime there's spending that takes place in the economy, that spending becomes another person's income. And so anytime you spend $1, GDP will actually increase by more than $1 because of all of the multiplier effect. So for example, if people save 25% of their income and they spend 75% of their income, and the government decides to build new highways for $200 billion, GDP is going to increase by that $200 billion initially. All right, but then the highway workers, finding that their incomes have increased, are going to spend a portion of that new income. So let's say they buy boats. So when they buy boats, GDP goes up by another 150 billion. I got the 150 because it's 75% of 200. Remember, they're saving 25%, but they're spending 75%. The boat makers are going to see their incomes increase by 150, and so they're going to spend 75% of that income and maybe buy some new iPod phones. So the total GDP increase from just the 3 rounds of spending is $462.5 billion. Now that's going to continue all the way until the last money spent is just 1 penny. And so we can use the multiplier to estimate how much GDP would actually change by. All right. So for example, here is a bridge that connects 2 rivers in Germany. They spent 750 million euros on this. If the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, what would be the impact on real GDP of the water bridge on Germany's economy? So, given that the MPC is 0.75, we would say that the MPS is 0.25. All right? And if the MPS is 0.25, we would say that the ME, the expenditure multiplier, which is 1 over MPS, 1 over 0.25, would have to be 4. And so what this tells us, let's go back to our Walden rule for a second. Change in real GDP is equal to our change in government spending times our expenditure multiplier. So if our change in real GDP, our change in government spending was 750 million euros, and our expenditure multiplier is 4, that means the change in real GDP could be as high as 3,000 million euros. Okay? So the answer was 3,000 million euros. All right, that's one review question. We're going to make these a little different every time just so that we can see all sides of this equation. All right, so now we have the MPC is 0.8 and France builds a bridge for $500 million. But they also increase taxes by $500 million to pay for it. So here's what we're going to get. A couple of notes. Don't forget, our change in real GDP can be found by taking our change in government spending times the expenditure multiplier, or it can be change in taxes times the tax multiplier. So we're going to have a couple things happen here. Okay, number one, the spending of 500 million, the spending of 500 million is going to multiply times, well, what's our expenditure multiplier? Let's see. MPC is 0.8. That means MPS is 0.2. expenditure multiplier has to be 5 because it's 1 over 0.2. Tax multiplier has to be 4 because it's 1 less. Alright, so first, on the spending side, 500 times 5 is 2,500. So GDP is going to increase by 2,500. But secondly, taxes are raised. So 500 in taxes times 4 is 2,000. Well, whenever you raise taxes, GDP gets smaller. So the net effect is 500 million. Now, there's a quicker way to do that. Since taxes were increased by 500 and spending was 500, this right here creates a balanced budget. Okay? And so we use our balanced budget multiplier, which is 1. And so we would say just 500 times 1 equals 500. Same answer. Alright, here's another bridge. Building lots of bridges here. So this is in China. They're building a bridge, and it costs $20 billion, and their marginal savings rate is 10%. So we're using a different word here. Marginal savings rate, 10%. That says that the MPS equals 0.10. Alright? That means their expenditure multiplier has to be 1 over 0.10, which is 10. So if they spend $20 billion times 10, GDP is going to change by $200 billion. Okay? So that's our review. Now we're going to talk about the new stuff, and that is this. Fiscal policy does not necessarily work as smoothly as we suggest. Okay? And that's because there are some things that we don't account for in our multiplier formulas. Okay? There's lag times. We're going to talk about that in detail. And there's crowding out. We're going to talk about those two things in detail. Less detail is going to be the negative net export effect and then something called saving shifts. So I'll just describe these real quick. Okay, negative net export effect. What we're talking about here is when the government spends money, interest rates go higher. And when interest rates go higher, okay, let me put a little note here, the dollar appreciates, and that causes exports to decrease. So while we're using expansionary fiscal policy to boost aggregate demand, the effect is that higher interest rates are going to end up reducing it just a little bit. Alright, so that's called the negative net export effect. Then we have what's called saving shifts. Okay, this one's kind of a goofy, weird thing. This will never be on a test because I think it's kind of stupid. But the idea is this. If the government spends money today and borrows, that means we're going to spend less in the future. And the reason we are is because we're going to start saving our money in anticipation of having to pay higher taxes. So in theory that sounds good, but the reality is that people probably don't really concern themselves with saving money today so they can pay taxes tomorrow. So anyway, I want to throw those two out there. The two major ones though are going to be the lag times and crowding out. Alright, so here's our lags. Okay, number one, we have what's called a recognition lag or a data lag. And what this represents is the fact that it takes many, many months before we realize what GDP has done in the previous quarter. So let's see, let's say it's November right now. We do not know definitively what our second quarter GDP was, even though it's November. So there's a lag in recognizing that. And since there is a lag, we don't know when we're in a recession until the recession's almost over. Okay? Then we have what's called the implementation or legislative lag. So let's say we figure out that we're in a recession. All right? Are we going to do anything about it? Because most of the time recessions are over within 6 months to 11 months, 12 months tops. And so if we do nothing, it's probably going to resolve itself and be over before we can do anything. So there's always that delay in figuring out if we should do something. Okay? Then there's something called the impact lag or the effect lag. It just takes time. A great example. this 2009 stimulus that was $1 trillion, it took more than 2 years to spend it. That recession was only 18 months long. So by the time we figured out we were in a recession and we decided to do something about it, well, let's see. The recession was from December '07 until June of 2009. This stimulus from 2009 was passed about 3 months before the recession ended, and it took 2 years to spend. Okay, and then the effects of the lags. Sometimes, I'll give you a great example from 2009. Now this didn't happen, but this could have happened. What if we're coming out of a recession and then all of a sudden we pump $1 trillion into the economy? That could spin us up into some really bad inflation. And so these lags, the fact that they exist, make the fiscal policy less effective than it otherwise would be. All right. Next.
What is love? Baby, don't hurt me. Don't hurt me.
Anyway,
No more.
the next thing we're going to talk about is crowding out.
Baby, don't
And the idea here is, well, if you look at this image, sometimes when my wife and I go clubbing, it's way too crowded, so we go home. That's what crowding out is like, okay? Except it's spending. So let's look. There's two types. Okay, our first type of crowding out, this just occurs when private spending falls in response to an increase in government spending. So for example, well, this sign kind of says it. What if I was planning to spend $100 on food, but then the government decided to give me food stamps? Well, now I'm not going to spend $100 on food, and in fact, I might just hold on to it and save it for later. Okay, so the government spending just replaced spending that I would have done otherwise. Okay, so there's no net effect. Okay, so overall spending may not increase, but our debt does, and so that's the first type of crowding out. Okay, example number 2 is the one that will be most commonly referred to as crowding out, and this just occurs when the government increases spending. They have to borrow money to pay for the spending. So let's look at what happens. We have our loanable funds market. Okay, there's a supply of loanable funds and a demand for loanable funds. Okay, remember, the demand curve, at least part of it, is investment spending. Okay, so the interest rate is very important when it comes to investment spending. If the government comes along and they increase borrowing, okay, so that they can pay for some stimulus, then you're going to see an increase in demand for loanable funds, and you're going to see a higher interest rate. Okay, that higher interest rate means there's going to be less investment spending in the economy, and there's probably going to be less consumption spending. All right, so that's the crowding out. The government spending ended up pushing investment spending and consumption spending out of the way because it increased interest rates. Okay, now let's demonstrate this crowding out thing using the cause and effect chain of expansionary fiscal policy. So when would we use expansionary policy? Well, we're going to use it in a recession. So I'm going to draw this economy in a recession. Got our long run aggregate supply curve. We have our short run aggregate supply curve and aggregate demand. Equilibrium is to the left of our long run curve, so we definitely are in a recession. Now, here's what's going to happen. The government is going to increase spending, or they could reduce taxes. Either one of those two things could happen. All right, when they increase government spending, aggregate demand is going to increase. Okay, that will also occur when taxes are reduced because that'll cause consumption spending to increase. So either one of those is going to increase aggregate demand. As you can see, real GDP has increased, and the price level has increased at our new equilibrium. We're going to have more employment because more output means you need more workers. But because of crowding out, real interest rates are going to rise. Those real interest rates higher are going to end up decreasing investment spending. Okay? That's the crowding out part of it. All right, so right here. If there's less investment, you're going to see aggregate demand drop a little bit. And so our Keynesian multiplier that we suggest, is a 5, let's say, it's not really 5. It's probably something much less, like maybe a 1.5 or a 2. All right. Now, I alluded earlier to the negative net export effect. Here's how that works. The higher interest rates are going to appreciate the dollar, and that's going to end up reducing our exports. And so aggregate demand, again, will fall a little bit. So once again, our multiplier, probably not really 5, okay, because of all these effects. All right. Here's something more specific. All right. This kind of demonstrates exactly what's going on here. So before stimulus, government spending is 0. Okay. After stimulus, they're going to increase spending by $100 billion. In order to do that, they have to increase demand for loanable funds. So we move from D1 to D2 demand curve. That shows our increased government borrowing. Now, before the government borrowing, our level of savings was at equilibrium A, so 250 billion in savings, and that equaled the investment that was going on in the economy. When the government increased borrowing, they also drove interest rates higher, and that increased not only their borrowing, but it increased savings because it gave incentive for people to save money. So savings went up by 50. So not only does it crowd out investment spending and consumption spending that is interest rate sensitive, but crowding out will also end up decreasing savings, increasing savings, which is going to further decrease consumption spending. So crowding out is real. Sometimes it's mitigated by Federal Reserve policy to keep interest rates low, but it still happens. Okay, and then here it is in reverse. Contractionary fiscal policy. We'll look at our cause and effect chain here. All right. When would you use contractionary policy? Whenever you're trying to solve an inflation problem. So let's draw the economy dealing with inflation. Aggregate demand is too strong. Price level. All right. So what are we going to do? We're going to decrease government spending or increase taxes. If we increase taxes, that's going to reduce consumption. So when we reduce consumption and government spending, the aggregate demand curve is going to drop. That's going to reduce our real GDP. It's going to lower the price level because that's the main thing we're trying to get done here. It's going to drive employment down as well. But now we're going to have the opposite. Instead of crowding out, we're going to have something that you might call crowding in, because lower interest rates are going to occur, and that's going to drive investment higher. That's going to depreciate the dollar, and that's going to drive exports higher. So the net effect of all that stuff is that aggregate demand is going to bounce back up a little bit. And so once again, this just tells us that our multipliers are not as effective as theory suggests once we include all these other things. All right, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at how traditional fiscal policy would help with stagflation. So what is stagflation? That is when we have high unemployment and high inflation. So it's like we're in a recession, but the recession is caused by a lack of aggregate supply. So it has reduced output, but it has also increased the price level. So if we use traditional policy, that would indicate we should increase government spending, and that would boost aggregate demand. But the problem is that if you do that, you're going to end up with an even higher price level. And so we don't really want that to happen. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to find policies that will boost aggregate supply, because that will bring our economy back to full employment and bring the price level back down. So that's the goal here that we're going to look at. Okay, this is called supply side fiscal policy. You may have heard of it. Okay, so what is it? What's the point of it? We're going to use government spending, taxes, regulations, and so on to affect the short-run aggregate supply curve. Okay, or even better, shift the long-run aggregate supply curve, and the short run will go with it. Okay, so basically we're looking for ways to get more resources, more technology, better institutions. Okay, let's see, as a reminder, higher interest rates, which is a complication to fiscal policy, that's going to affect long-run growth because it reduces investment spending, which reduces capital. And you can't have economic growth if you don't have more capital. Okay? So, let's look at these suckers. Alright, so it's our goal. We basically want to shift long-run aggregate supply and, of course, short-run with it to drive the price level lower and output higher. Okay? So here are some things. Okay, these are some things that were done in the 80s, and they're still considered probably good ideas to boost output today. So research and development tax credits, that's what R&D is. Okay, what we're trying to do there is give incentive for firms to invest in new technologies. Okay, new technology is going to shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. Policies that focus on education. So what we're trying to do here is boost our human capital. Okay, if our workforce is better, they're going to be more productive, and that can shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. Okay, here's some more things. Lower corporate profit tax rates. So right now, our taxes are the highest on the planet for corporations. And the problem there is that if they have to spend more in taxes, they don't have that money to purchase new capital or to invest in new research and develop new technologies. Okay. Then we have marginal income tax rates. So the point of this one is that if we lower personal income taxes, people have more money to save, and if you have more savings, you're going to have more investment. Okay. So why does all this work? Well, here's the thing. It turns out that if you have tax rates that are too high, it actually not only stifles investment, but it actually will reduce revenue to the government. And so it's not necessarily a good thing. For example, in 1962, the top marginal tax rate was really, and I'm not making this up, it was 91%. That means once you reached a certain income level, all you got to keep was 9 cents out of every dollar you earned. So can you see why that would destroy incentives to innovate and to work hard and stuff like that? So what we're going to look at is something called the Laffer Curve, which will demonstrate to us why tax rates, if they're too high, it can end up reducing revenue. Okay, so origin is 0. What this tells us is that as the tax rates are increased, you're going to see tax revenue go up. Okay, so you can see everywhere along here, tax rates increase, revenue is also going to increase. Okay, up to a point. All right. Once you reach that point, whatever it is, okay, we'll call it X here. At that point, higher tax rates actually are going to reduce government revenue. So that 91% tax rate was probably around here. All right. The 28% is probably around here. Okay, there's no way of really knowing unless we run experiments, but I think most people would agree that if they're too high, you're going to reduce revenue. If they're too low, you're not going to get enough revenue to the government. And so we need to find that happy middle. Okay. So when people look at the Laffer curve, okay, there's different thoughts here. All right. Political point of view has an effect on how people view the Laffer curve. Liberals tend to point out the left side of the curve, so this side over here. Okay, they generally believe that we're always on that side, and that if you increase taxes, you're going to increase tax revenue. Okay, conservatives point out this side. They think that if we're on that side of it, if you increase tax rates, you're going to reduce tax revenue. And so there's that back and forth argument. Okay, both sides are equally important though, because you got to know where we are if you're going to put in place efficient taxes.
Come with me now. Come with me now. Come with me.